Good morning and welcome to the sixth and final day of MAC's virtual annual conference. I'm Derek Milo, MAC's Communications Director and your moderator for the first session today, which will be a workshop on the Federal Family First Act and its effect on Michigan counties. The Family First Prevention Services Act, there's a mouthful, provides foster care entitlement funding for a limited set of prevention services for up to 12 months for families and children at risk of entering or re-entering the foster care system. Our speakers today are from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Soleil Campbell and Sarah Goad will detail how this act will work in Michigan. A few quick notes before we start. We will take questions at the end. Please type your questions in the question field and we will review and pose them to the speakers. We should finish in about an hour. The event is being recorded and will be posted to the MAC website at a future date. Now, the rest of the schedule today after this workshop is, we will move into a short MAC Board of Directors meeting, which everyone is welcome to attend, where we will be swearing in a new board member and handling some other routine business. And then after that board meeting, we'll move into the final workshop of the conference, which will be on emergency management funding. So please stay logged in for that because of course that's critical to all of your budgets. So with that, I would like to invite Soleil and Sarah to the conference. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Sarah Goad and I am the manager for the Foster Care Program Office at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services in the Children's Services Agency. I have over 20 years of experience in child welfare. I've worked with private agencies providing child welfare services. I've worked for the state of Michigan. I've worked with foster and adoptive parents. I've worked with runaway and homeless youth. So I have a vast experience with different levels of service within the child welfare realm. My co-presenter today is Soleil Campbell, and Soleil is a manager within the Juvenile Justice Program Office. And Soleil also has a vast experience in the child welfare realm as well. And so we're going to speak today, as you've heard, about the Family First Prevention Services Act. And I will speak in general about the act, as well as in regards to our youth who are under supervision of the Department for Abuse and Neglect. And Soleil will chime in with information that is specific to our juvenile justice programs and our youth that are in under the supervision of the Department for Delinquency. So that is a little bit about us. And so today I would like to review with you just an overview of what the Family First Prevention Services Act is. We'd like to talk most specifically about congregate care and what the implications on congregate care are, what the requirements of qualified residential treatment programs are. We have a draft process for what it is going to look like for a youth to be approved for placement in a qualified residential treatment program. So we'll share that with you. We'll talk about the legislative changes that have occurred in Michigan to make this possible. We'll talk about the training that has occurred and is going to occur both for courts, counties, as well as our child welfare staff. And then we'll share with you our draft timeline for implementation of the largest pieces of this act. So the first thing that I would like to talk about is the law itself. This law was enacted in February. It was signed into law in February of 2018 by the president. This really is groundbreaking legislation. Historically, funding for child welfare, and it's specifically for foster care, was tied to the old AFDC and could really only be used when a youth was removed from their family home and placed into out-of-home care through foster care. And that was both for juvenile justice youth as well as abuse and neglect youth. So this law allows us and opens up the use of Title IV funding for other things, and most notably for prevention services. And so it really gives us the ability to use federal funding in a way that I think both the child welfare community, counties, courts really have wanted to serve families, but were not able to because of lack of resources and the way that this federal funding tied us to removing youth from the family home before we could access it. So we are very excited in the state of Michigan that this law was enacted and really allows us to look at how we serve families at the front end, and hopefully are able to prevent as many families from having to experience the separation of placement in foster care. We have been working in this state over the last 24 months, really, and prior to that, on one of the large pieces of this legislation. And so when this was enacted, it really fell in line with work that we were already trying to do around reform of the use of our congregate care facilities. So the main, the four main visions of the federal legislation were the expansion of Title IV to cover prevention costs. So as I said, really that ability to use that funding to prevent youth from having to be removed from their family's care and serve them in the community, in their family. It limits the funding that we can use for congregate care, and really the idea behind the limiting of that funding is to ensure that congregate care or CCIs are only being used for youth that must have a more restrictive level of care for treatment purposes. It also expands reunification services, so it allows us again to use some of that funding at the time of return home, so that children do not have to be out of home. If they do have to be removed, we can hopefully shorten the length of time that they have to be out of home and have access to more services when they do return home to help stabilize that place, that return home. And then finally, supports for youth transitioning from care. So really the goal of that is to help our older youth who I think we know a lot of times when they end their care, their time in foster care, they are not always ready to live on their own. But oftentimes, many of them, that is their next step, is that they are living independently. So it has extended the length of time that we can provide support services to youth through our older youth services like YAVFC. There are many other smaller pieces of this act, but we really wanted to just kind of talk about those main areas or share those main areas of that act with you. If you're not familiar with the entire act, I am happy to share that with the conference coordinators so that people can look in further detail at those additional pieces of the act. So what we're here today to talk about really are the implications of FFPSA on congregate care and what it's going to look like in Michigan. So when we look at FFPSA and the main portion of FFPSA that has to do with congregate care, it is the section that limits the use of funding, Title IV funding, for youth who are placed in congregate care. So there are some qualifications or requirements that have to be in place for us to claim as a state Title IV reimbursement for these youth. The CCI has to be a qualified residential treatment program. And I'll talk a little bit further about what those requirements are and how we're going to certify them, if you will, as a QRTP in Michigan. They have to specialize in services for pregnant or parenting teens, or they have to be providing human trafficking services or youth that are at risk of human trafficking, or they're providing services for youth that are 18 and older and living in a supported independent living setting. So in Michigan, we have been working with our providers for the last 18 months or so on preparing them as facilities to be qualified residential treatment programs. They have known what the requirements are. We've provided a lot of technical assistance, and we decided as a community that even those programs that specialize in pregnant or parenting teens, that specialize in human trafficking services, that those will also be certified as qualified residential treatment programs, because we as a community believe that the requirements of QRTP are standards that all of our youth deserve, and so we made that decision collectively with our providers, that those were standards that they would all meet as well, whether they were in a exempt category or not. So when we look at the specific requirements of QRTP, you can see that these main areas are things that maybe seem like maybe not that big of a deal. But as I said, we've been planning for this for the last 18 months to make sure that we have everything in place for Michigan to be considered QRTP compliant. A portion of these requirements fall to the state, a portion of the requirements fall to the courts, and a portion of the requirements are very facility specific. So each youth that is considered for residential placement or congregate care placement will have to have an assessment within 30 days of placement that justifies their need for that more restrictive placement. That assessment has to be completed by a qualified individual according to the federal act. So Michigan MDHHS put out a request for proposals in June, and we have received bids from interested contractors to provide that assessment service. And we're working on identifying our providers for that right now. That assessment includes the completion of a functional assessment tool, and it also includes that qualified individual speaking with the child and interviewing them, speaking with and interviewing other members of the case team. So the caseworker, if they're a therapist, other service providers that have relevant input on the needs of that youth, the parents, if the child is in a foster home or a relative placement, speaking with those caregivers, and really anybody who is on that child's team that can help give that assessor a full picture of what that youth's needs are. They'll also be doing a case file review, so they would be looking at any evaluations that have happened for the child, whether those be psychological evaluations, whether they be educational assessments, anything that can really give them that full picture of this child of what this child's needs are. And then they are making a recommendation at the end of that assessment as to whether this youth can be served in the community or whether their needs justify placement in a congregate care setting, a more restrictive setting. If they recommend that the youth should be served in a congregate care setting, they have to provide detailed justification as to why this youth's needs cannot be met in the community. So this is not just a sign off of, oh yes, this child has some behavioral or mental health needs and they should go to a residential. This is a very in-depth assessment that ends with this recommendation, as well as short-term treatment goals for the youth and long-term goals for this youth. Once that assessment is completed, that recommendation then has to be provided to the court. The judge will then review that recommendation, and they will have 60 days from the time of placement to approve of or not approve of that recommendation. Now, funding is tied, 4E funding is tied to every step of this process. So if the assessment has not been completed within 30 days, then the state is not eligible to claim 4E for that youth placement. If the court approval is not completed within 60 days, then the state is not eligible to claim for 4E funding for that youth stay in residential. The things that are required of the residential facility or the congregate care setting in order for us to say that they are a qualified residential treatment program, they must have a trauma-informed treatment model. So we have been working with our provider community and with national and state level experts to develop a framework for what that looks like. We have not identified a specific model that providers must use, but we have identified the elements that must be present for us to certify that they are trauma-informed and trauma-responsive in their treatment, really, and in their entire organization. They have to have 24/7 availability of nursing and clinical staff. So whether that is nursing staff that is on site or they contract out with somebody for after hours services, they have to have that available, as well as clinical treatment staff availability 24/7. A lot of our providers already have agreements like that in place. So thankfully there was not a lot of too many changes that had to be made for them in that area. Family outreach and inclusion. So really engagement of families, whether it is the youth family of origin, or if the youth has an identified potential, if their goal is an adoption and they have an identified adoptive family, or if they have supportive adults who are in their life. It's really including those individuals who are going to be able to support the youth beyond leaving the program, including them in treatment and building of supports for that youth as they leave the program. So we are requiring that our providers show us how they are engaging and that they are documenting that engagement in the process. And then they have to provide discharge and aftercare services and supports for at least 6 months after a youth leaves their program. So currently our contracts with our providers for abuse and neglect require them to provide 3 months of aftercare services. It's not very well defined currently what that looks like or what that means. So what a youth receives, a youth and family receive in aftercare services is kind of all over the board right now. So again, we worked with our provider community to develop a two-tier system for aftercare services. So depending on whether or not the youth is already connected with service providers in the community at the time of discharge, or they are not, kind of determines which tier or level of service they will be receiving in aftercare. If they are, say, already connected to community mental health, we don't want to overwhelm them and then also have treatment providers from the residential coming into the home. So the residential would, in aftercare, would be really providing kind of an oversight and check-in to ensure if there are other needs that that family has that they can connect them with, and making sure that they are still connected to that service provider, filling any gaps if those services fall off for any reason. If they are not connected to a community service provider at the time of discharge, then the residential would be required and expected to provide individual therapy and family supports until the time that that youth is connected to community services. And then last but certainly not least, in order to be a QRTP compliant and certified, the CCI must be licensed by a nationally accredited program. So there are a handful of programs that were listed in the Act specifically. And then there are a few that have been approved by the federal government since the Act was signed in 2018. And they will approve if there are other national accrediting bodies that meet their standards and requirements. Those could also be approved in the future. In Michigan right now, with our JJ and our abuse neglect providers that we currently work with, I would say at last count, about 95% of our providers are accredited. And the majority of the remaining providers are in the process of becoming accredited. And that is a big step and a big hoop for them to go through if they were not already accredited. And so again, you know, our partnership and working with them over the last 18 plus months has allowed them the time to you know, get up and ready for accreditation and to go through that process with the accrediting bodies. So I want to kind of pull out one of the pieces of the QRTP requirements that really affect the counties, and that is the court approval piece. So there are two main times when the courts must approve what is going on with a youth that is in a residential setting. And that's the initial court approval. So as I said, within 60 days of the start of each placement in a QRTP, the court has to look at that assessment that has made a recommendation, and they have to approve that recommendation. They really need to be looking at, you know, can the child's needs be met in a home, in the community? Is the QRTP, the residential that the youth is being placed in or considered to be placed in, is that really the least restrictive placement that they can be in? And the short and long-term goals that have been provided in that assessment as well, do those meet and are they consistent with placement in a residential setting and in the type of residential setting that youth is being placed in? And does it really meet with the youth's permanency plan? This initial approval, we have been working with SCAO on the development of and updating of court forms. So this approval, judges will have the opportunity to choose whether they want an actual court hearing to review this, or they can do a desk review. And then once that has been completed, they will, you know, they just have to sign off on that order. And then that will ensure that we can continue with 4E funding. If a judge looks at this recommendation and the recommendation says this youth should be placed in a congregate care setting, but the judge does not agree and feels that the youth can and should be served in the community, then they can disagree with that and not approve the recommendation. And then the agency, the department, has 30 days to move that child out of that residential and back into the community, and still be able to claim 4E funding. If that youth is not moved within that 30-day time period, we would then not receive the 4E funding. So there is a little bit of cushion if that determination is made by the court that that's not an appropriate placement. The other place that the courts have to review these placements is at their quarterly hearings, as well as permanency planning hearings. The department is working to incorporate specifics around these residential placements into the service plans, so it'll be very clear what the recommendations were, what the long and short-term goals were, what the child's progress in that placement are, and why they need to continue placement in that setting. And so that at each hearing, the judge will just need to recertify or reapprove the continued placement in the residential setting. So another requirement of this federal act is for children who are recommended and approved for placement in a qualified residential treatment program. We have to have a higher level of approval within the department when a youth reaches a certain length of stay. So for youth who are under the age of 13, if they are in a CCI for 6 months, either consecutively or non-consecutively, that requires the approval of the MDHHS director. So currently, Director Gordon would have to sign off on any youth who are in congregate care who are under the age of 13 for 6 months or longer. For youth who are older, 13 years or older, that review and approval must occur at 12 months consecutively or 18 months non-consecutively. So in the department, we have been working on an approval process that will allow our CSA director and then our MDHHS director to approve those placements. Our goal is to have very few youth that are in congregate care for longer periods of time. So really not having too many approvals that have to go to that level. Again, this is something that we have been working with our provider community on for longer than since prior to this legislation being enacted. Reducing that length of time that our youth are in treatment to ensure that they're only in that restrictive setting for the time necessary to stabilize them and provide the treatment that they cannot receive in the community, and then continuing that treatment in a community setting. So I just want to take a minute to review and this is in draft still, so there may be a few things that change slightly. So I just want to review what that looks like. So caseworkers will identify youth who they think may need residential treatment, which is what happens now. Currently, when they identify a youth as needing residential, if it is a youth who is in an abuse and neglect setting, then our they send a request to our regional placement unit. If it is a JJ youth, then that request goes to our juvenile justice assignment unit. And either one of those look at the youth's needs. They reach out to our residential providers, they make the referrals, and then connect the caseworkers with those residentials once a residential has accepted that placement. In the future, when a caseworker identifies a child that might need a residential placement, they're going to complete a pre-screening. So it is going to be looking at things like, what are the youth needs? What are the youth diagnoses? What services have been provided already in the community? Really kind of trying to kind of identify, why can this youth not be placed in the community? And it cannot just be that the caseworker can't find a foster home or a relative placement. And so that's, you know, why they want to place the youth in residential care. It really has to be based on the treatment needs of that youth. So if that pre-screening tells them, yes, this child could be a candidate for residential treatment, then they are going to make that referral to the regional placement unit or the juvenile justice assignment unit. The RPU and the JJAU will do their own review of the cases, looking at many of the same things, and they may be requesting additional documentation from the caseworker, and you know, asking additional questions about service provision in the community and placement in the community. If they then also identify that this child is a candidate for placement in a residential, they will make the referral to the qualified assessor, independent assessor. That qualified independent assessor is going to complete that functional assessment, which is the CANS, and they're going to complete that full comprehensive assessment that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. Once they complete that, they will send that recommendation to the caseworker and back to the RPU and JJAU. That, as I said, that has to all be completed within 30 days. So our goal, if you can see, as I talked about the legislation earlier, the timeframes for qualifying for 4E funding say that these things have to be done within 30 days of placement. But our goal is to complete the assessment portions prior to placement whenever possible. We don't want to place youth into a residential and then be in a situation where we're scrambling and trying to find a different a community placement for youth because they don't qualify based on the assessment or the judicial review. So we really want to do that up front if possible. So once that assessment is completed, that recommendation, and if QRTP is recommended, then the RPU or the JJAU will match the child with a residential provider that makes, and then they'll make that referral for that placement, and they'll be doing that based on the recommendation of the qualified assessor and those long and short-term goals for that child. Matching those up with the program types and providers that we have. They also will be trying to keep the youth as close to home as possible, as close to their home county as possible, because we know that the farther away that they get from their home county, the more difficult it is to engage family and other caregivers and supports in treatment, and to continue those face-to-face visits, which are so critical for our youth. The residential treatment provider, if they will accept those referrals, and then that child will be placed in the QRTP. At the same time as that is going on, the caseworker is going to send that completed assessment to the court, and the court is going to review that independent assessment. As I said, that can be done by scheduling a hearing, or if there's an upcoming hearing, that can be done at the hearing, or if the court prefers, they can do a paper review or a desk review. Once they make the determination that they approve of that placement, then they will sign that order, and that will be sent back to the caseworker to ensure that we are compliant with 4E funding requirements. So there were a few legislative changes that had to be made in order for us to ensure compliance with the federal legislation. So in the Michigan legislature passed Public Acts 6 through 10 of 2020 to support the implementation of FFPSA. And those placed definitions of qualified residential treatment programs, as well as foster family home, foster family group home. Modifications to those definitions were in this legislation. It put the court approval process for the qualified residential treatment programs into the legislation, and it also put the requirement that was in the federal act for criminal history checks for child caring institution staff. So now all staff who are employed by and have any interaction with youth must have a criminal background check. And so that is everyone from treatment providers, the licensee, all the way through maintenance staff, food service staff, direct care workers. So everybody who is on those campuses, interacting with those youth, or could even just come in any kind of contact with those youth, will have to have a criminal background check. So training is a big component of this, and the federal act is very specific that we must provide training for the courts. And so SCAO and MDHHS have been working to develop that training. We have, as I said earlier, when we talked about the court approval process, we worked to develop the updates and new court forms. SCAO is working on the development of some court rules, and we are working to put together training for judges, court staff, and child welfare staff. Those trainings will occur in probably late November through December, and then we will send out at the end of January just some follow-up and reminder points, as our intention is implementation of these new contracts and court requirements in February of 2021. So just a look at a timeline. The main things that we have to put in place to ensure our qualification for 4E funding was the passage of that legislation, which happened in December of 2019. We have to update our state plan and have that reviewed and approved through the MDHHS director, through the governor's office, and then through the Federal Children's Bureau. We have to implement QRTP specific contracts for our residential providers. And we've been working on those for quite some time. And those will be executed in, as I said, February 1st of 2021. We also are drafting policy, internal policy for the department for our caseworkers as well as our residential providers. And those policies will go into effect in February of 2021. We have to have the contract in place for our independent assessors. And that contract will be in place. On here it says December. It probably will be a little earlier than that so that we have time for those independent assessors to hire staff, to train staff, and to get all of their requirements in place for beginning those assessments in February of 2021. Those judicial reviews, as I said, will coincide with the contracts and policies, which will be February of 2021. And last but not least, budget appropriations, which we right now are waiting on that budget process to ensure that everything that we have in place is budgeted for through our state budget. So I know that this is was a lot of high level information with some details mixed in the places where I felt like counties and courts might want the most information. As I said, there will be more specific training that goes through procedural requirements for the court and court staff as well as caseworkers as we get closer in December. But I am happy to take any questions that folks have right now.
All right, great. Thank you, Sarah, for that in-depth presentation. I do have one question from one of our members who identifies himself as an older person, which I'll try to summarize. It basically boils down to what is the proper nomenclature to refer to people who are being assisted through the foster care system?
So if we're talking about our youth, then we usually talk about them, we usually refer to them as youth who are in foster care.
Okay.
Yeah.
Youth in foster care, got it. Still have time to pose questions into our question field for members of the audience in the interim. And Sarah, I'm not sure you can answer this or not, but can you talk a little bit about the magnitude of the shortage of foster care families in Michigan?
So if we look at our number of beds that we have licensed or identified, we have enough beds to cover the number of children we have. Where the shortage comes in is we may have a number of homes who have placed their beds on hold, or we may not have the right kind of home for a child. And when I say that, I really mean, so if we have children that have specific medical needs, I think one of the biggest needs that we have right now, and especially as we look at how we will be assessing youth and their ability to be served in a community as opposed to going into a residential care facility, is families who can help our youth who have severe mental health or behavioral health needs. And that doesn't have to be somebody that has a therapeutic or clinical background. We are really trying to build those supports in as well with other programming, recognizing that, you know, not as many youth may be placed in residential in the future. And so identifying what supports these families will need in order to stabilize placement for these youth. So whether that is respite services for the caregiver, or assistance with somebody coming into the home at different times, or the connection and therapeutic services that youth needs in their community. And we're really just trying to help build that. So the need is there to identify homes that are willing and able to work with our youth that have higher behavioral and mental health needs, really. And I also think we have a need for juvenile justice homes. So youth that have a delinquency charge, that is something that we also are in need of.
Okay, another question from the audience. Can you talk a little bit about the additional stresses that the pandemic has placed on the foster care system?
Well, I think like everyone in every other area, the pandemic has placed stressors on our providers, on our children. I will say that we have been so impressed with our provider community, both our foster family homes, our relatives, and our residential providers, and how they have stepped up to the plate to ensure that our kids' needs are met. Obviously, as everybody is experiencing, we're having to learn new ways to meet the needs of our children and families that we're working with. Some of the things that the department has done, we have, when we look at our families that are at risk of potential abuse and neglect, the department reached out to families who had previously had contact with the department just to check in with them. Because we know with the isolation and the loss of jobs and children being at home for extended periods of time, that places a lot of pressure and stress on people's lives. So we were doing check-ins with families just to reach out and say, hey, are there things that you need? Are there things that we can help you with? So we have been able to connect families with food, to connect families with mental health services, just to give families an opportunity to know that somebody is reaching out and thinking about them. And we have gotten a lot of positive feedback from those families that we've reached out to for that effort. I don't know that the stressors that have been placed on our foster care community are that different than the stressors that a lot of you are probably feeling.
Okay. All right. We're going to be wrapping up here. One final question for you, Sarah.
Sure.
I'm sure the department, your office probably do some surveys of the general public in regard to foster care. What, from the department's perspective, is the number one hurdle between a family that might be willing to serve as a foster family and them actually doing it? What's the biggest hurdle for them to clear mentally to get them serving in the foster care system?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think, as I said, I have historically worked with foster and adoptive families, supporting them. And I think, the majority of our families that come to us to serve foster children, they have had to have contact with or touch the information or idea of fostering on average 3 to 5 times before they will engage in the process of becoming a licensed foster home. So I think that is one thing, just being cognizant that it's something that takes people a little bit of time. And so not, if you're looking at recruiting or you're looking at how to help families become involved in this, it is just a repeated experience with our system is one thing. The other thing I think is knowing what supports are out there. And that, as I said, is something that we are really trying to grow, the supports to stabilize placements. And so ensuring that those supports are there, ensuring that families are connected to other families that are providing the same kind of care. And I think that those are really important factors in helping somebody to feel confident and comfortable in making this commitment. It's a very large commitment, and we recognize that caring for somebody else's children who have experienced trauma, and even just the experience of being removed from their family home, no matter what has gone on there, is a traumatic experience. So our caregivers that give up their time and their homes and welcome children and families into their lives, we recognize that that is a very big thing for them. And so it's not something that everybody can do. And so if you have people that are maybe interested, one of the things that we do too is try to get people engaged in other ways, providing respite, providing childcare, providing, help at different events that are set up for foster and adoptive families, so that they can engage with the system, engage with others that are providing that work, and really determine whether or not this is something that is for them and their family.
Okay, great. Again, thank you, Sarah, for the presentation today and the data. I do just want to point out that little stage direction there. Just do want to point out that Sarah's slide deck will become available on the MAC website on Friday. And as I mentioned, there is a video recording of today's session, which we will place to the MAC website at a future date.